Week 14 of the fantasy season is here. So before you set those final starting lineups, here are 5 stats that you need to know before week 14 of the fantasy season. All right, Seahawks running back Kenneth Walker has played in over 50% of the Seahawks offensive snaps for 2 straight weeks. He has logged at least 14 touches in back-to-back games and has had overall great receiving involvement and increased goal line usage as well. And he faces the Falcons defense that has allowed the 9th most fantasy points to opposing running backs per game on the season so far. So I don't exactly want to get suckered into another week. Kenneth Walker is a solid start because the looming shadow behind Kenneth Walker at all times is Zach Charbonnet at the running back position, who has 3 touchdowns scored in the last 4 games and actually has had scored 7 touchdowns since week 4 of the season. And in that stretch, we've only seen Kenneth Walker score 1 time. But the more efficient running back has still continued to be Kenneth Walker, who has 4.19 yards per carry, are better in each of the last 4 games. He has had 3 receptions in 3 straight games. He is getting the involvement in the receiving game. And yes, he is still getting those goal line touches as well. But we're just going to see volume in this Clint Kubiak system at the end of the day go to Zach Charbonnet and to another running back. But man, this is a game that the Seahawks, if they win this game, they are in outstanding overall standings in terms of the playoff picture. And I think they're going to come out here against kind of a battered Falcons team here and have a really good outing overall. And like last week, the offense just did not need to do anything against the Max Brosmore-led Vikings. So I think this is going to be a good day for the Seahawks run game on the road here against the Falcons. So it depends on what other options you have. But I think that Walker is just a very safe option going into week 14 of the season. I'm not going to call him a must start. I don't think that his ceiling is incredibly high, but I think he could be in line for a better overall ceiling game like we saw in week 11 against the Rams, where he actually finds the end zone, as opposed to what we've seen over the last 2 games with 13 or less fantasy points. But double digits, definitely a safe floor territory for Walker this week, and there's still at least some upside, although Zach Charbonnet is still in the mix. This matchup makes Walker very much in play here in week 14 of the fantasy season. All right, Green Bay Packers wide receiver Christian Watson has been amazing over the past 3 games. He has seen at least 5 targets in each of those games and has scored 18 or more fantasy points in 2 of them. He now draws a great matchup against a Bears defense that has allowed the 3rd most fantasy points per game, 2 wide receivers, and 24 touchdown passes, the 4th most in the NFL. So I think that Christian Watson continues to be a very strong flex option. Could be a wide receiver 2 option for you guys as well. I know he said he's been amazing in the last 3 games, and he's really been amazing in 2 of the last 3, but was still pretty good in week 12, where he had 9.9 fantasy points and had encouraging usage with 7 targets in that game in a tough matchup against a good Vikings secondary. But this is a big game. Playoff implications here. The Bears trying to stay afloat in the top of their division, in a close division with the Vikings on the outside looking in, and the Lions still in the mix here, and all 3 of those teams in the mix for the playoffs in general. And this is the first time on the year where we've seen the Packers and Bears play each other. I think that Watson's going to continue to get a lot of usage, get those red zone looks, and he's going to continue to be a solid flex option and a strong matchup against the Bears. I mean, we look on the season so far, in only 6 games played, Watson has averaged 12.6 fantasy points per game, so his floor is very safe here, but we know that the upside is there as well. Yeah, Jaden Reed's going to be back in the mix. We know that he's coming off IR. He's going to be active this week, and Matthew Golden is still looming around somewhere, and he's questionable going into this matchup, but I don't think it's going to hurt Christian Watson necessarily, especially in terms of Jaden Reed's first game back here in week 14. I don't think the volume is going to be insane or anything, but in this Matt LaFleur system, I mean, basically anything goes, right? But Watson's in a good spot here. This should be a competitive game script. It's a good matchup. I think that Christian Watson is looking like one of the better overall flex options with a lot of good upside, touchdown upside here in week 14 of the fantasy season. All right, Broncos running back RJ Harvey has the backfield essentially all to himself for the rest of the season and delivered big in Week 13 with 16 touches and 21.2 fantasy points, 2 rushing touchdowns against the Commanders. He gets a great matchup against the Raiders this week. Bottom 12 in terms of fantasy points allowed to running backs on the season. But if we look over the last 2 weeks specifically, the Raiders have given up the 4th most fantasy points to running backs and the most touchdowns to running backs over the last 2 weeks with 5 total touchdowns allowed. So I think that this is a great spot for RJ Harvey, who was very productive last week from a fantasy perspective, mainly because he scored the touchdowns and had 3 catches, though. If you look at it, only 2.6 yards per carry off of 13 touches in a good matchup against the Commanders. But I do think that we don't want to kind of like read too much into that. He is getting enough involvement in the passing game where he should, have 2 or 3 catches at worst, and he's going to get essentially all of the inside the 5 carries for the Broncos. And yeah, he is essentially dominating the usage here, but we are getting some volume to Jaleel McLaughlin. He's had 7 touches in each of the last 2 games in which Dobbins has not played. And then last week we saw Tyler Batty get a little bit of involvement. He had 3 catches off of 5 targets. So we'll see how it all shakes out here, but it should pretty much just be RJ Harvey's backfield to himself, like I said. And once again, he's going to get the volume in the passing game, or at least enough to keep him afloat. He's going to get the red zone touches almost undoubtedly. And this is a great matchup. I know the last time the Raiders and Broncos played, it was a gross Thursday night football game. It wasn't high scoring. The Broncos, at home really didn't do anything offensively, but the Raiders just look like they're in a bad place right now. The defense has been struggling. The offense, I don't know how Geno Smith is still starting, how they haven't tried to throw another quarterback out there at this point, but this is a big divisional game. And I know the Broncos are basically in the playoffs at this point, but they have a chance to catch the number 1 seed in the AFC, fighting right there next to the Patriots. So they're going to come out here and try and lay it on a divisional opponent and trying to do whatever they can to win these final couple games in the season. So I think Harvey is a very good start. I got a lot of questions about him in Saturday night's live stream, and almost every single question I said, start RJ Harvey with confidence. And that's still how I feel going into the weekend. If you guys own RJ Harvey, he should be in your starting lineups here in Week 14. All right, Vikings wide receiver Justin Jefferson has had a disappointing season so far, no question about it, averaging just 8.7 targets and 12.9 fantasy points per game. In Week 13, managed only 2 receptions for a career low 4 receiving yards with backup quarterback Max Brosmer under center. Even so, it's going to be very difficult to bench JJ this week against a Commanders defense that has allowed the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And I've talked about this a bit throughout the week. You have to consider Justin Jefferson this week as a must-start player. Even if he's your flex option, if you're not looking at him as a wide receiver 1 or 2 anymore, so be it. But he has such a good opportunity to bounce back this week against the Commanders. And yeah, McCarthy's not good. I know it. And, he's had a ton of turnover problems, a ton of accuracy problems, but he's not nearly as bad as Max Brosmer. And this is still an opportunity at home for the Vikings to show some life at the end of the season here. Kevin O'Connell, a great offensive-minded coach, a great overall system here in terms of throwing the football. And I know it's been rough. I know this season hasn't really supported that thesis, but you got to feel good here against the Commanders, a team that on the season has allowed over 2,000 receiving yards, 14 receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers, and 143 total catches. This is just too good of a spot to ignore. And we saw, Cortland Sutton this past week show up in big fashion, had a very solid game against his Commanders secondary. I really think that JJ can come through here in Week 14. And, I think overall, when we really break down JJ on the season, he's still 7th in total targets amongst all wide receivers, number 2 in total snap share, number 8 in route participation, number 7 in air yards, number 9 in deep targets, number 12 in first read targets. Then going just a little bit further here, number 9 in receptions, number 10 in receiving yards, number 3 in unrealized air yards. So a lot of these metrics, he's still ranking very high amongst all wide receivers in good categories, and also ranking very high in categories that have a tendency to tie to very bad quarterback play that doesn't necessarily reflect the wide receiver. I think we all know that that is the case with Justin Jefferson at the end of the day. So great matchup this week. I'm taking the chance on Justin Jefferson. Maybe the ceiling will be limited by the quarterback play, but I think that the chance for a very safe floor is there. I think the chance for JJ to score a touchdown, which we have not seen happen since week 9, we've only seen happen twice on the season, is absolutely there in week 14. And I talked about it in an earlier video here at the end of the week, but through the playoffs, a very strong strength of schedule for Justin Jefferson. The Cowboys, the Giants, and the Lions. These are all teams in the bottom 10, actually in the bottom 5 in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. So I still think there is a chance at some hope here at the end of the season for Justin Jefferson, and it's going to start right here in week 14. Right, last but not least, fantasy managers who own Patrick Mahomes should temper their overall expectations against a Texans defense allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Houston also gives up the second fewest fantasy points to wide receivers and the fourth fewest fantasy points to tight ends. The Texans defense has the right personnel to cause problems for Patrick Mahomes, and the Chiefs don't have a strong enough run game or offensive line to create a real challenge in the run game against the Texans. So I do think that the Chiefs will be forced to throw the football here in week 14 at home against the Texans, and what is a big game for both of these teams. The Chiefs basically have to win this game to keep their playoffs hopes alive, right, after losing to the Cowboys this past week. And the Texans still in the mix in the AFC. They may not win their division, but they're very much in the mix for a playoff spot here, and they could still technically win that division. So this is a big game for both sides here. And listen, we look at Mahomes over the last 4 weeks, 18 or less fantasy points in 3 of the last 4 games. Obviously, he had a huge game against the Cowboys defense. We were expecting that. He wasn't bad against the Colts necessarily. Just didn't throw any touchdowns in that game. 18 fantasy points is fine, good enough, but 14 or less against the Broncos and the Bills. Very tough matchups there against the quarterback position. But this is the Texans. They are the toughest matchup against opposing quarterbacks. Like I said, they've only allowed 12 passing touchdowns on the entire season, and they've only allowed 2,300 passing yards, and they have 11 interceptions to that mark as well. So this is a tough spot. And listen, I don't want to necessarily bet against Patrick Mahomes in a must-win situation, or even just Andy Reid and this Chiefs team and general. And once again, I think that the Chiefs will be forced to throw the football in this matchup. But just think back to just a couple weeks ago what the Texans were able to do against Josh Allen in a pretty big game in a primetime spot, right? So I'm worried about Patrick Mahomes if I'm a fantasy manager. He's been great this year. I've been really pounding the table all season long since early in the season to trust Patrick Mahomes and start him. He's a QB2 in fantasy points per game. It's just risky this week. If you have other options that you can consider at quarterback and you own Patrick Mahomes, I'm at least considering those other options here in week 14. And there you guys have it. There, my 5 stats that you need to know before week 14 of the fantasy season. As always, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comments down below. So be sure to drop all your fantasy questions down there. I'll get back to as many of you guys as I can before kickoff for week 14. And while you guys are down there, does me a huge favor, helps out the channel substantially if you guys subscribe and hit that like button on the way out. When the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, we have everything here on the channel that you could possibly need to dominate week 14 of the fantasy season. And we're going to have everything that you could possibly need to dominate the fantasy playoffs weeks 15 through 17. So make sure you guys are checking out all the content as it drops for the next couple of weeks. And with that, I'll say good luck here in week 14. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.